Alright, hello everybody. Today we're going to be just going over some of the changes I'd like to see come to Discipline Priest in sub point 2. All these changes are super minor things that kind of will hopefully alter some of the problems Disc have. So we saw in a blue post made just kind of highlighting healer balance, and specifically they talked about Disc Priest. And basically what they said in this is how he puts it really well, how mana sensitive Disc is, and how well it reacts to external mana cooldowns, so like Innervate. So for anyone who is aware of what Disc does with Innervate, is it is able to cast out a lot of powered radiances, which applies a lot of atonements, and then atonements we can heal through doing a huge amount of burst healing with things like Light's Wrath, big penances, etc, etc. So what this causes is Disc to be quite average without the Innervates, and then with Innervates you'll see it coming ahead and extending well over a lot of other healers. So something that they were just saying is they're looking to address some of the possible ways of fixing this and some of the possible avenues. They go over how they could make more atonement applications a thing, or be limited by cooldowns or charges, blah blah blah. And I think as someone who's been playing Disc for a fairly long time, and I think you'll find this with a lot of people who actually play Disc, is that the playstyle right now is actually really 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 good. A lot of people like the playstyle because it's very rewarding if you do it correctly. It's very different to a lot of the other healers, and it's just a fun way to play, being able to preemptively do a lot of things. So when big healing comes out, you can you have everything planned out. It's a very thought out spec, and it actually does work very well in a lot of encounters. We see it working very well across a lot of encounters in Nighthold, but it does have its inherent issues where if you do get something like an Innervate, it does increase the power of Disc Priest dramatically. So what I really think the issue is the amount of power gain you're getting from the Innervate. So it's not that Disc is bad without Innervates, it's not that Disc is overpowered with Innervates, it's just that the difference between the two is too large. So what can we do to fix that? So if we look at the issue, it is purely based on how we apply atonements. So we apply atonements in the Innervate through our Powered Radiance, which is a very high cost mana spell, and then obviously applies 3 atonements, which are incredibly powerful when it comes to healing. So what one suggestion that I kind of had one idea that I've had is to reduce the mana costs on Radiance. So this will increase Disc's overall mana efficiency, and then slightly reduce its gain inside Innervate, because Innervate makes your spells free. But that's just a raw buff to the class. So in compensation, what can we do? Well, it has to. So I'm just going over my thought process. Well, then it has to be something to do with, if we can apply more atonements through casting more powered radiances, then the atonements possibly shouldn't be as strong. So this, and if we have a look at our talents, there's one talent which increases Contrition increases our atonement duration by 3 seconds. So this talent was originally 2 seconds, and it was never taken. Now I think if this atonement was still 2 seconds, and I think as the tier went on, I think people would actually start picking up atonement at a 2 second duration. So what I'd like to what I think would be a good implementation change would be if they reduce the mana cost in Radiance by a small amount, 10% or so. And then if they then, to compensate, reduced the increased atonement gain by Contrition back to 2 seconds. So this would have the effects where we would be able to cast out more radiances within a fight, so we'd be able to apply more atonements, but they have a very very those atonements have a 1 second less duration. So this will make the class slightly you'd be less impacted by how many atonements you get, ever so slightly. We're talking about very minor tweaks here, but that's all Disc needs. Disc doesn't need a playstyle overhaul, doesn't need, anything dramatic change to it, just needs minor tweaks. So, we'd be able to get out slightly more radiances, but would have slightly less uptime on the radiances we put out. Now, another thing I'd like to, just on this line of, the tier 75 talents, is that we see from past, what we see was we were taking Twist of Fate and Power Infusion on a relatively frequent basis. We were swapping between them. Now we don't see these taken almost at all anymore. They're basically never taken, just because Contrition is too strong. So this is again another reason why I would see Contrition to be nerfed a little bit. And then obviously we might see a chance for Twist of Fate or Power Infusion to come back. Now I think Power Infusion is something I would as well like to see kind of adjusted just slightly. Now Power Infusion is good because as a Disc Priest, what you're looking to do is you're looking to do burst healing in windows, you're looking to dump mana in certain points in the fight. So one thing I would like to see change to Power Infusion is that its cooldown actually be reduced to 1.5 minutes, and that would be to line up with Light's Wrath. I think with a high uptime on something like Twist of Fate would still be better. Contrition might still be, would be your go-to choice for a fight where there's consistent damage, and then Power Infusion would come in really nicely if there was, specific points in the fight where you could line it up with Light's Wrath very frequently, and you could save mana by doing that. So what you love to see in the talents is a whole lot of synergy and a whole lot of choices, and I think this would create a very good situation for all of these spells. Whether reducing Power Infusion's cooldown to 1.5 minutes makes it too strong, then we might see it. I'm just putting ideas out there. If Power Infusion comes too strong at 1.5 minutes, then maybe reduce the haste buff of it or something, and then minor tweaks again just to change sort of certain things so they're not overpowering, so we see choices. This is one thing Blizzard doesn't really do, is minor tweaks, and I think it's something they can do just to fix some of the issues some of the classes are having. The last issue that I kind of have with the talents is Shadow Covenant. So we see the level 100 talents really aren't that interesting for a lot of single target fights. So for example in Crosis, you basically never take Grace because you're not ever using Shadow Mend, so there's not really ever any reason to, you're not ever going to gain benefit out of using Grace because you're never reapplying atonements on people with that have atonements, and the healing gain from it, 80% of our healing is from atonement, so it situationally buffs none of our healing. So Grace is never taken. Purge of the Wicked has a slight mana cost reduction to Shadow Word Pain, which is probably the biggest benefit to the spell in a single target situation, and the damage is slightly increased. So what I'd like to see is a Shadow Covenant made to be a talent that we can take as on a fight where Purge of the Wicked isn't good. So I'd love to see Shadow Covenant actually have interaction with our atonements, and I would like to see it in the way of it has the same effect, but it applies to our atonement targets. So what it can be is, when we get up to say 20 atonements, we can chuck out a Shadow Covenant. It can do a lot of healing to all our atonements and then still have that negative effect. Maybe put a cooldown on it so it's not something, you just get to 20 stacks, spam Shadow Covenant, and then don't worry about your damaging spell. I think that would be a fairly bad playstyle. So I think a good idea for Shadow Covenant would be making it so it applies, does the heal to everybody affected by your atonements, has a cooldown, and then still applies that healing absorption effect on them. So I think you know, that would just be, again, another tool in our toolkit that we can talent into on a fight where something like Purge of the Wicked is not useful. So on something like Croesus, Shadow Covenant might be the way to go, whereas if we get to something like Botanist, Purge of the Wicked would be the way to go, and then, you know, Grace you can take in sort of lower, you know, 10 men content where you might actually have to use Shadow Men to spot heal certain targets, or again in Mythic Plus is where you would take Grace. So I think just, you know, slight tweaks to how some of the talents work can open up a lot of options for the Disc Priest, and then, you know, help out some of the issues it's having. And the last thing I would like to address, which was a great suggestion that Atonement had on Nero. So one of his suggestions was increasing the duration of Barrier, so we can get 2 Penance casters cast inside Barrier. So for people who aren't aware, Nero right now is... the tooltip for it is actually wrong. So what Nero does right now is it, when you chuck down a powered barrier, it'll heal targets just that don't have Atonement with Penance like they had Atonement. So if we're looking at good playstyle, when you chuck down your barrier, you're going to be having 20 Atonements on the raid because you want to be making maximum efficiency out of that barrier, because you get double healing on your barrier through Barrier for the Devoted. So what I would like, you know, if we had this change, you know, if they could actually change Nero's tooltip so it did what it said it did, so it's not misleading, so people aren't, you know, it's not extra healing on top of your Atonements. Penance doesn't do any extra healing to a target that has Atonement, it only does it to targets that don't have Atonement. So what they could do with this is obviously fix the tooltip so it makes sense, and then add an additional effect where it increases the duration of Barrier by 2 seconds. So what this would allow Disc Priest to do is actually cast 2 Penances inside Barrier. Now Penance has a channel time, and it also, Barrier has its initial GCD. So even though it's a 10-second duration right now, you're going to chuck it down, you're going to be 10 seconds is from your first global, your global's going to tick out, and then your Penance has the channel time. So if it's 12 seconds, if you go Barrier, Penance, globals inside, and then Penance immediately afterwards, you're going to be able to get 2 Penances inside that Barrier, which are going to do a large amount of free raid healing. And then what that can cause is that can cause Barrier to actually be a mana saving cooldown. So rather than you having to put out 20 Atonements for when you want a Barrier, you can only, you know, you can just chuck down your Barrier, maybe you have 10 Atonements, you can do some raid wide healing with your Penance, you can do some other spells inside that, and then you can do some more healing with your Penance. Now this, again, you know, it's not going to be the most optimal way to heal, but it does give you that choice where you can use Barrier, you know, in a certain part of the fight where, you know, the raid might not be taking everyone might not be taking a 2.5 mil hit where you need to heal that up with Light's Wrath. You can then line it up with, you know, it might be, for example, like the slashes on Spellblade, where there might be a small hit where, you know, there might be a 1 mil hit where Barrier hits, you know, reduce the damage of that, you can heal it up with a Penance, next one comes in, then you can heal it with the second Penance. So that would just buff the utility of this legendary, so it was, you know, an actual good legendary. You know, there was a niche use for it. The other thing that would be quite nice is switching the stats from Major Crit to Major Mastery, because we see a lot of our legendaries already have Major Crit. So Major Crit, Major Crit, Major Crit. So this one I think should be Major Mastery. Or, I mean, any of the legendaries should. We just diversify it a bit. Anyway, they're my suggestions. I would love to hear any of your feedback about, specifically, the one thing I would really like to see, you know, the more I think about it, the more I like it, is the slight reduction on Radiance, and then the nerf to Contrition would just open up more options for the class, make the class slightly less gain from having Innovates, and then obviously buff the class for, you know, it'd be a bigger buff for the class for people who don't have the Innovates. Yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback, and thanks for watching.